Hello bookish friends, my name is Gail and I am the Fiction Bookworm. So it's been I think at least a week, maybe a little more, since I've posted a video. I've been very slacking the past few days. I've had some health things that I've been focusing on rather than focusing on making videos. But I'm back. I've had this particular video percolating in my mind for a little while, so I'm really excited to share it. I am doing the end of the decade book tag that I found online just because I wanted a way to kind of think about how to think about a decade of reading. I've been struggling for about a month trying to come up with a way to share this, and I think the end of the decade book tag is good. I know that Books and Lala did something like the tag that I'm going to do. I don't know if she did this exact tag, but I found one online and I wanted to share it because I think it wraps things up pretty well. So it breaks down the decade into three parts: 2010 to 2013, 2014 to 2016, and 2017 to 2019. And you just kind of look at your reading during those three parts of the decade. And so I really like that because those are actually probably some good breaking points for me and my reading. It'll be interesting to see what things I remember reading from 10 years ago. So 2010 to 2013, this was before Goodreads, or at least before I was using Goodreads. I started in 2014, which I think makes that kind of the perfect break right there. So I just have to rely on my memory for how much I read and what I read. That was a time of transition for me. I started off 2010 living in Russia. I know when I was there, I read a lot of more escapism and less serious stuff, more light and fluffy things, a lot of which could be called romance, I think, historical fiction, maybe more historical romance. Just because living in difficult circumstances, it was harder for me to read hard books. I came back to the United States in early 2011 and had kind of a 6 months of transition while I was figuring out what I was going to be doing next. And then I moved into this house at the beginning of 2012. And so that's really the part when I can start to remember some things for sure that I've read beyond just some kind of fluffy books for fun. I know when I moved into this house, I started reading nonfiction books in my lunch hour. It was like a deliberate choice to read nonfiction. And so the first book that I read was called Saving Gracie so the full title is Saving Gracie: How One Dog Escaped the Shadowy World of Puppy Mills by Carol Bradley. And I read this book because about that time I adopted a dog who was a puppy mill rescue. And I had been reading a lot about puppy mill rescues for a few years before reading this book, just online, lots of stories, which is why I was interested in rescuing a dog. And so I read this book to try and understand my dog a little bit better. It was a hard read, but it was very impactful. And then after that, I read a couple of more nonfiction books by an author that I really, really liked and just have never forgotten. Even 8 years later, or almost 8 years later, 7 years later. And this is a reporter named Barbara Demick. And she has reported in some really difficult places. And she wrote a book called Longovina Street, Life and Death in a Sarajevo Neighborhood. And this is about the Bosnian War, which was a very hard read, but really insightful. It's something that I felt like I lived through. It happened in my lifetime, and I was even an adult at the time. I was in college, I think, when this happened. But I didn't feel like I knew very much about it or what it was really like. My sister-in-law is Bosnian Croatian, and she lived through it. So I thought this was a really important and really good read. This author has also written another book that I read after that that I actually found even more interesting, especially having lived in Russia and having been near North Korea, within Russia, but still close to North Korea, on vacation one time. And that is called Nothing to Envy, Ordinary Lives in North Korea. And that is about people who had escaped North Korea and were telling their stories. So it was a lot of information about, like in the late 80s and early 90s, when the Soviet Union withdrew its support, was a time of terrible famine in North Korea because they had been getting food from the Soviet Union, and with no more Soviet Union, that meant no more food. And so it was a terrible time of starvation, and a lot of people escaped. The one story from that book that I will never ever forget is a woman who was a doctor, and she managed to escape over the river into China, and she's kind of wandering around looking for a place for shelter and to try to get some help. And she sees this dish of rice and food outside the house just sitting on the ground. And she's like, what is this bowl of good food doing sitting on the ground? And then she realized it was a food bowl for a dog. Like, that was the dog's food. And she looked at that and she was like, people in North Korea are not able to eat rice. Like, they didn't even have enough food that they could eat rice with every meal. And so, like, this dog was eating better than the people in North Korea. And she was a doctor, so she was in a good position for someone in North Korea, but even so, that was way better food than what she was able to eat. So it was a really powerful book. So that kind of describes my reading. I wish I had numbers. I have no numbers. I did not record how many books I read in any of those years. So let's move on to 2014 to 2015, or 2016. So in 2014, I read, according to Goodreads, 60 books. In 2015, I read 45 books. And in 2016, I read 24 books. So a lot of that, the decrease in numbers is explained by the fact that I was in grad school during those years. And 2016 in particular was the year I was working on a thesis. So that's why my reading was steadily declining. Even though I did count all of my textbooks as books that I read, I still didn't have enough time to do as much reading for fun. But during that time, what genre did I read the most besides textbooks, the textbook genre? Again, I probably would say romance and historical fiction, mostly because, you know, when I was not reading my textbooks, I wanted to read something fun and light and enjoyable, to be something that would be relaxing and just enjoyable. So my favorite authors during that time were probably Diana Gabaldon, because I did reread the Outlander series as far as I had read before in the late 90s and early 2000s. I reread all of those books, and then all of the books that I hadn't read to that point. And also I discovered Susanna Kersley, who's another author who writes this sort of dual timeline, magical elements that are linking the two different timelines. So there's like a modern story and a historical story and some kind of magical element that links them. I love Susanna Kersley. She's definitely one of my top 10 authors, I think. And so I discovered her during that time. And then the last time period is 2017 through 2019. And so in the last 3 years of the decade, I read, in 2017, I read 44 books. And so that was the year, I think, that in the first half of the year I was finishing my thesis, and the second half of my year I was reading a lot to make up for the year of working on my thesis. And then in 2018 I read 62 books, and in 2019 I read 64 books. So it seems like my top-ish range is around 60 books, my middle range is around 40 books, and my low range is is 24 books. So that kind of defines the last 2/3 of the decade. So I would imagine the first 3 years of the decade were probably pretty similar, probably in the range of 40 to 60 books a year, depending. What genres did I read the most? So the last 3 years, I have had a little bit of a change in my reading habits, and that is because, number one, along with finishing my master's degree in 2017, I found a local face-to-face book club. And so that really helped change my reading habits, I think, of the first part of the decade, except for when I was really, at the beginning of the decade, for a couple of years, focusing on trying to read some nonfiction. This really expanded my genres. And so my book club has always made a conscious effort to kind of read like some memoir or similar nonfiction. We've read a lot of literary fiction. We've read some classic novels. We've touched a little bit into even some, or at least one, maybe science fiction. So we've tried to read like sort of a variety. So like some historical fiction, some contemporary fiction, like Celeste Ng, which is not something I would have picked up on my own. So that really expanded what I was reading beyond just the things that I like to fall back into, like romance and historical fiction. So that was really good, and I really enjoyed that. So I have read a much wider variety of books because of that in the last 3 years. What are some of my favorite books and authors that I found in these last 3 years? So it's hard for me to say specific authors because I feel like I've read so widely. I haven't read like one author a lot. I did discover Deborah Harkness and the Discovery of Witches series in the last 3 years, just in the last year actually. And so I did read that trilogy in the last 3 years. So that was one new author that I discovered that I've read a lot of. You can see her books right here. I have this shelf here, which is the books that I've discovered through the Once Upon a Book Club book box. I discovered that in the last 3 years. And that has really widened my reading. I've read a lot of authors that I never would have found otherwise, and some really great books. Anne Mosh, I really loved her book, and I'm hoping to read more of hers. I haven't had a time yet. Beatrice Williams, Lauren Willig, and Karen White. I've read all 3 of the books that they have written together, and I've loved all of them. That's a new discovery for me. The other one that I really liked Aisha at Last by Uzma Jalaluddin. I think this is her first novel. I'm hoping to see more from her. Yeah, so quite a few new authors. I feel like just a wide variety of new authors, people that I had not heard of or read before, which is really exciting. I'm really excited to have like new authors, new to me authors. So just to kind of talk about the decade as a whole, I have a couple of questions here. One is, do you have any regrets about your reading during this time? And I would have to say that I probably have some regrets because I think earlier in the decade I wasn't in a book club, and so I wasn't reading with purpose. One of the books that we found in my book club was Homegoing by Ya Jessie. I never would have found that on my own. I don't think, I guess it did get a lot of buzz, but I don't know that I would have actually picked it up and read it. So I'm really glad I did, and that my book club forced me to do that. Yeah, there have just been a lot of books that I never would have read otherwise. And so I have been in a book club before in the 2000s decade, and I really missed that, and I am really glad that I'm in one now. But yeah, that's one regret, is not having a book club for all of that decade. I wish I would have, even when I was in grad school. I don't know if I would have had time, but it would have been really nice to be reading more with a purpose rather than just trying to kind of read on my own. And then the last question about my decade in review is, when did you find Booktube, and has it changed your reading habits? So I actually found Booktube just last year. I'm pretty new to Booktube, which is mostly because I was doing book podcasts. So I found podcasting probably in 2014. And so I've listened to podcasts for a long time, and book podcasts for quite a while. I listened to Anne Bogle's What Should I Read Next? And a bunch of other podcasts. Some of them have stayed for a long time. Some of them I've only listened to for a little while. My most consistent book podcast has been What Should I Read Next? So, and I think that one might only actually be 3 years old. But anyway, so, you know, I think that book podcasts and Booktube has exposed me to people that I might not otherwise have picked up. And it's given me some inspiration to read more. The fact that my 2019 number was up to 64, I felt like was partially due to Booktube, because I was reading more so that I could talk about books more. And I think that this year my goal is 72 to 100, kind of in that range. So I'm hoping that this will help me to just forge on and read more widely as I, see what some other people are reading as well. I find books through podcasts. I find it through my book club. Sometimes the ones on the podcasts or the Booktube are ones that become my book club books because I suggest them. So I'm hoping that that will continue, and my reading interest will just continue to broaden. So thanks for watching. I hope that you are able to think about your year in review. I'd love to hear what your decade looked like, if your reading habits have changed, how they've changed, what you regret and what you would like to do better. So please let me know in the comments down below. Give me a like, give me a follow. You can find me on the social medias, and I'll put in the notes below some of the books that I have read and loved. So thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye.